before they were buried in this massive grave.
Straight back now to Rafah, where the Palestinian Civil Defense is talking about those mass graves.
Genocidal war waged by the Israeli occupation against our people in the Gaza Strip. The General Directorate of the Civil Defense responded to calls that were received by our operations room all over the Gaza Strip. We received over 100,000 calls since the beginning of the aggression, part of which civil defense crews could not respond to, and this is due to the occupation not allowing our crews to access the concerned areas, particularly the area of Khan Yunis, where the ground incursion continued for over 4 months. Like I said earlier, the civil defense received thousands of distress calls since early December 2023. Part of these calls came from injured people who were under the rubble. Unfortunately, we could not deal with them. Following the pullout of the Israeli occupation army from the governorate, our crews rushed immediately to the areas from which we received distress calls by the injured people, and after 4 months we only found decomposed bodies and skeletons. Operation rooms received calls about hundreds of civilians being lost at the Nasser Medical Hospital. We immediately moved in concert with our brothers and forensic evidence and the governorate, and we went to the Nasser Medical Complex, where we found 3 mass graves behind the morgue, in front of the morgue, and near the Hind Ad-Daghma dialysis building. These mass graves, in these mass graves, the bodies of martyrs were stacked together, and there were indications that field executions or summary executions were conducted, as well as suspicions of physical torture that maybe some bodies were subjected to, as well as suspicions that some of the murdered people were buried alive. We outlined a field plan in order to excavate the mass graves and unearth the bodies. We documented the process, and our crews deployed all over the Nasser Medical Complex, and we recovered roughly 392 bodies, including 65 bodies that were identified by the families and 227 bodies that remain unknown. So 58% of the bodies that were exhumed, the identity we could not confirm, and this is due to a number of reasons. The occupation changed the markings that allow us to identify the bodies. Some of the bodies were mutilated, and some of the bodies were placed in bags that aggravated the decomposition process. And after 202 days, we call upon the international community to put pressure in order to put an immediate end to this aggression against our people and allow the entry of all humanitarian organizations in the world and international media to take a look at these crimes. And now I will give the floor to Dr. Muhammad Al-Mughayyar, the head of the Follow-up and Coordination Committee, to tell us about the evidence that was recovered from these mass graves. Doctor, the floor is yours. In the name of God, most compassionate, most merciful, may Allah's peace and blessings be upon you all. We followed a number of steps. We followed a series of steps in order to document the mass graves and the crimes that were committed by the occupation. We documented all the areas and the previous steps that were taken in order to excavate mass graves. We examined the depth of the bodies. We removed the sand that was covering the bodies. We brought in white shrouds. The operation continued for 7 days. The search operation and recovery operation continued for 7 days. And during those 7 days, our crews came up against a series of challenges, which we will be addressing in some of the photos that we have. Like we said, the bodies were buried at a depth of over 3 meters, which contradicts the rules that we have in the Gaza Strip, and also the accumulation of bodies is also a violation of the rules that we observe for burial. We also detected the use of other types of shrouds that are blue in color and black in color, and this accelerated the decomposition and led to the disappearance of some evidence. We also noticed that the hands of some of the martyrs were actually tied using plastic ties, and we will be showing you some pictures. Here we can see a civilian wearing a white overall. Apologies, the audio is not clear from the source. The civilian is clad in white overalls, and as you can see, he was executed in the field. He has a gunshot wound to the hand and to the head, and his hands were tied. And this evidence shows that he was executed in the field. Another proof of field execution of some of the civilians. We can see the gunshot wound to the head and the hands that were tied. Here we also have some marks and some evidence of the torture that some of these dead people suffered at the hands of Israeli occupation soldiers. As you can see, this body here was stapled, and this makes us suspicious that we might have an organ theft on our hands, where organs were stolen from some of the bodies. Here we have this civilian who's clad in scrubs. He was potentially arrested and martyred as the Israeli forces raided the Nasser medical complex, which caused the end of all surgeries at the complex. We also found the bodies of a number of children, and here we have questions. We would like to know what is the reason why we have children in mass graves. This shows and proves that the occupation is still leading a war of genocide where over 14,000 children were killed, so roughly 40% of the total number of martyrs in the Gaza Strip are children. This is also the body of a child, Hala Fares. Her legs were amputated, and her parents told her that she was alive prior to the invasion of the Nasser medical complex by the occupation soldiers. We also noted that some of the bodies, their hands were tied using belts, using fabric, and this also shows that some of the civilians were subjected to torture by Israeli occupation soldiers. We also found the bodies of children. This child is no more than 15 years old, and this body was recovered from these mass graves, and this once again shows that the Israeli occupation is still committing atrocities against children in the Gaza Strip. This is an identified civilian whose mother showed up to the complex during the unearthing process.